We can afford mass to go back to school and a whole lot more. This is modern monetary theory for kids. What I'm about to tell you isn't comfortable, but it's really hard for adults to accept the truth, so I'm relying on you. You know when you ask your parents to buy you a toy and they tell you, we can't afford it, or how are you going to pay for it? The phrase we can't afford becomes an indelible pain that shapes adult thinking throughout life. They try to run away from it. Here comes the difficult truth for the we can't afford it parent. Modern monetary theory. Modern means relating to the present or recent times. Monetary, relating to money or currency. And theory is a system of ideas intended to explain something. So modern monetary theory is a newish idea about how the money system works. Let's talk about a few different types of money systems. Your family system you probably already know, where somebody works, get paid for their work, pay for their own needs, and then pay taxes to the state or federal government. And if they need to, they can borrow more money from the bank to pay for their things like housing and transportation. For the state, they get their money by collecting taxes and getting revenue back from the federal government, and states pay for their own needs. And if they need to generate more money, they do it through taxes or bonds, but they'll pay for things like schools, police, roads, parks. And so far, pretty straightforward. Here's where it gets weird with the federal government. Modern monetary theory only applies to the federal government. And states that the federal government can print as much money as it wants. The federal government is the money issuer of fiat currency. In the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, Congress has the ability to coin money. You're thinking we're going to be rich. But no, even though we can print all that money, you need a little more information. A little bit of background. Money does not grow on trees. But because of the fiat currency, the federal government could replace every leaf on a tree with a $1 bill or a $10 bill or a $100 bill. Everyone in this country would be a millionaire, billionaire, or trillionaire. And when I use these big numbers, a million seconds is 11 days, less than 2 weeks, and a billion seconds is 31 years, about the time of a modern computer. And a trillion seconds, that's 31,000 years. That's when we first started painting on walls and caves. Also, the U.S. does not print money. It just changes numbers in a spreadsheet. So, modern monetary theory and about 5 other concepts will help us understand how this all works. First, was a dollar worth? Everyone had $1 trillion. Would a drink still cost $1 at McDonald's? No. When everyone has $1 trillion, then stores can charge more money for stuff. We call this inflation. So you could have $1 trillion, but inflation says it's not that easy. Modern monetary theory haters, who are the we can't afford it people, are really concerned about inflation. To them, this is what keeps them up at night. They think everything causes inflation. The reality is, it depends on some other stuff, whether you have no inflation, some inflation, or a lot of inflation. It relies on where we spend our money. If you have $1 trillion and go to the toy store, you could cause serious inflation because you have all that money to go spend on cheap stuff. They'll charge you more. If you have $1 trillion on a COVID-19 vaccine, well, you're going to cause minor inflation because you're not going to go back to get a second vaccine. If you had $1 trillion and you put it under your mattress and never spent on anything, you would cause no inflation. So where the government spends this money impacts inflation. And the we can't afford it people who think that inflation is a monster under their bed, it could be, but probably not. Next up, not only does it depend how many dollars you print and where you spend your dollars, it also depends on the fact that these are American dollars, backed by American worker productivity. Worker sacrifices keep the American dollar stable and strong. We're highly efficient, don't strike, accept stagnant wages, work multiple jobs, accept high personal debt, lowering health outcomes, minimum job protections, and benefits. And Americans accept the idea of natural rate of unemployment, which requires us to keep 5 to 6% of our workforce unemployed via welfare or prisons. For working Americans, wages, prices, and cost of living haven't changed much. In other words, inflation has been happening for the last 40 years. And other factors keep our American dollar strong are Federal Reserve policy, trade agreements and statecraft, petrodollars, sanctions, bonds, can ask your parents about all that stuff. So the value of a dollar is not just how much there is, but also the worker fact that these are American dollars backed by workers and sacrifices. Now, you've probably heard your parents talk about taxes, and if the government can print money, why do we have to pay taxes for stuff? The federal budget of $4.5 trillion is spent on a bunch of great stuff. But the taxes, well, the federal government takes your money and, yeah, the federal budget of $4.5 trillion is not paid for by taxes. Americans and taxes enable our budget by keeping the dollar steady and checking inflation. But federal taxes don't pay for the budget. Yeah, adults freak out when they see that part. And taxes are more than a means to our budget. We got to talk about taxes a little bit more. They're part of our justice system. We give tax breaks for having kids and buying a home. And we also give tax breaks for your art collection losing millions of dollars or buying a $1 million yacht. Tax justice should keep inflation of wealth and power balanced. And we can afford it people are convinced that taxes fund spending. But modern monetary theory says spending happens separately from taxes. And that difference, we'll get to that in a moment. Deficits. You probably hear your adult parents talk about deficits. And the we can afford it people become the how are you going to pay for it people. And then their fear becomes the deficit. The national debt. And politicians freak out about this. But don't fall for it. Our debt has been going up by trillions of dollars. This is just extra money in the economy. But who gets that money? Between just March and September of 2020, 643 American billionaires made an extra $845 billion during that time. Now, we know the government gave $1,200 per worker, but for every American worker that got that $1,200 check, billionaires got $5,400. Do the math. 5,400 times 153, $845 billion. So billionaires and large corporations have experienced inflated wealth during this time. We should call the deficit extra money in the economy, or another word for it, stimulus. How are you going to pay for people? Call that difference a deficit. Modern monetary theory calls that extra money in the private sector. The difference between what we tax and what we spend as a government. And are Americans cool with this? Well, applying a family's budget system to the federal government is lazy and limits our potential to be great. And our federal politicians decide how the government spends money and how much it will create. Why don't adults get this? Let's start with our news media. They like to tell us things we're familiar with. And a lot of them are bankrolled by those same billionaires that are benefiting so much from the extra stimulus. So when you look at the news people, it's hard to get that newsman or woman to understand something when their salary depends on their not understanding it. And our politicians have the same old thinking and the same old results when it comes to how our budget works. We can't afford it. How are you going to pay for it? They'll ask you all the time. And applying our family's budget system to the federal government, not recognizing the federal government is special, well, that's just a story that our politicians like to tell us. They like to tell us that they're going to make our problems disappear, or that they're going to return to what we had at some point in the past. These stories are common tropes we see in movies, and politicians feed off of that. They want to make it a black and white choice. Politicians and the news media have it easy telling adults to accept the system. Modern monetary theory breaks that thinking. It demands we think bigger, better, towards the future. So a quick recap before we get to the future. One of these is not like the other. Federal state budget rules do not apply to federal spending. Federal government creates its money. Inflation is real and is happening if you're super rich. Taxes enable our budget by checking inflation. The deficit is stimulus money for the private sector. Where the government spends its money matters, and the federal government politicians cannot hide behind family state budget rules, no matter what the media story is. So we can afford military spending, healthcare for everyone, full veteran benefits, aid and debt relief for farmers, and afford infrastructure, student and medical debt relief for everyone, full special education funding, mental health services, drug treatment, green solutions for a brighter future, and bailouts for Main Street, not just Wall Street, worker bailouts, state bailouts so we can keep our schools open. And yes, we can provide masks and PPE to safely reopen schools. Modern monetary theory doesn't mean you get everything. But modern monetary theory in balance means we can use it to raise the standard of the American worker. Let's start with masks and PPE to safely reopen schools. And what can a kid do? As much as adults like to rationalize away potential, kids, you guys are great at reasoning. Talk to your parents today about modern monetary theory and see if it's right for them. Have them call their congressman, congresswoman, senator, and have them understand modern monetary theory. Get everyone to go out and vote. Eventually, we'll make the changes. If you want to learn more, learn about the deficit myth from Stephanie Kelton, listen to the MMT podcast or Tax Justice Network podcast, do your own research. And thank you for watching. Now, as a side note, this gentleman is Senator Mitt Romney, and a lot of other politicians are going to tell us that Social Security will run out of money and we have to make cuts. That's what helps Grandma and Grandpa live on their own. But Grandma and Grandpa don't have to move in just because of Mitt Romney. Social Security can never run out of money. Even our Federal Reserve Chairman has said so much under oath at Congress. Don't let politicians tell you the government will ever run out of money.